Well, good morning, Layman. Good to see you.
You too, sir.
Yeah, so we're getting together this morning to take a deep dive into the first of Wilber's unpublished, semi-published Kosmos Trilogy Excerpts. And we really thought about doing this because really they get too little love, and it actually, they show a kind of a leading edge of his own thought. The document that I have for the Excerpt A that we're going to be looking at today goes back to 2004. And so this has been out for a while. And I think, even it anticipated integral spirituality that came out, a little bit later, a couple years later. But to me, it's a more advanced statement of some of the ideas that were in integral spirituality. But again, because they're not collected in a single book volume form and they're just available as PDFs on a few websites, I just don't think they've really come to the same center of attention for our community. And I think they're valuable and worthwhile to look at, especially for you and I and our interest in integral postmetaphysics and postmetaphysical spirituality. What we're looking at today doesn't directly deal with spirituality per se, but it does begin to lay out some of his key ideas towards articulating an integral postmetaphysics. And so I think it's valuable for that. And this whole series of discussion going through the excerpts, I think will allow us to go deeper into this idea of integral postmetaphysics and implications for spirituality and transdisciplinarity and some other things like that. One of the things that we've emphasized in a number of videos here on the integral stage recently, because we're in morphic resonance and prehensive unification with multiple other communities out there, metamodern and Game B, and a lot of stuff that's being talked about by John Vervaeke and Rebel Wisdom. There's a lot of concern around the meaning crisis and sense-making crisis and various legitimation crises. And I was just struck going through Excerpt A by how much he went into some of that and really anticipated some of the strong focuses of dialogue now back in 2004. You could say really before things became superheated through Facebook and other media, really challenging sense-making and I think a greater sense of breakdown in a coherent shared meaning in our culture that we've seen in recent years. So I think it's valuable for that also. And this is not going to be, in my understanding of it, and this is partly an excuse for me to be a little bit relaxed and casual here. I don't have prepared speeches about the book to give, but I want to take this forward, like a book study and really look at the things that stood out for us and struck us as valuable and pertinent for today. We had our recent conversation with Wilber, which was a delight. I really loved having that conversation with him. But I would say in that conversation, he emphasized more of his older perennialist model than he did some of these newer post-metaphysical articulations that are present, in the excerpts. And I don't know that he's necessarily abandoned them, but he definitely didn't forward them in the way he talked with us. And so I think, this is an opportunity for us to really look at that side of him.
Yeah, I'm excited. This can be a lot of fun. And I grew up on a farm, so I have this visceral feeling about what it's like to dig around in the muck trying to get a stump out of the ground. Right? You just don't know what is actually connected to what, and you got to get in there and get filthy and trace things around. So I hope that's what we're going to do, is dig around in the muck looking for structures. These are really rich and, as you said, anticipatory documents in many ways. And I think that Wilber is often at his best philosophically in excerpts and footnotes and things like that, where he's can cut loose and doesn't feel constrained by the burden of being a public spokesman and simplifier of his own notions. So there's a lot of great things in here. To me, it seems like this document has three really interesting features. And one is that he does start to emphasize the possibility of a post-metaphysical approach through a probabilistic reading of integral theory. I think he says, in integral post-metaphysics, deep patterns are no longer understood as structures. Even if we use that word, now he's talking about the probability of finding particular types of holons in, I think he says, particular modes of space-time.
Right.
So that's really interesting. We get a look at his analysis of social change. And I think this document is ground zero for integral Marxism, which is very intriguing. And also the more well-known part, I think, the integral methodological pluralism, his at-bat swing to see if he can describe what would be the necessary upgrade to pluralistic thinking in order to put it back at the leading edge. So all that stuff is really neat. When I first read this online years ago, I thought I understood it, but the combination of my own ongoing reorganizations and, I want to say, spending some time personally with Ken recently has helped me see the structures and significances of this document a little bit differently. I think there's probably a general principle. I said this to Andrew Cohen: the transmissions come across more potently and richly if the human reality of the transmitter is more apparent.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like, if you don't have a visceral sense of what Nietzsche's worried about and what he finds funny, you're probably going to misread Nietzschean texts. Mm-hmm. And likewise, if you don't have a sense of who Ken Wilber is as a human, there's probably things you will not encounter that are in the text. Especially, we're dealing with a guy who kind of instinctively has to retell you his entire world picture every time he opens his mouth. So you have to be familiar with that and able to put that aside, able to recognize who he is as a person and use that to sift out the novel elements that very often are embedded in each of the things he brings forward. So to me, that's an essential skill. The more you know Ken, the more you can figure out why what he's saying here is actually interesting and different than what you think he's always saying.
That's a great point. And I want to just echo that about being able to spend little time with him personally. And I was blessed to be able to do that many years ago when I was a JFK student, and we went out to his loft and spent a weekend with him. And when we were first developing our Foundation for Integral Religion and Spirituality, I had a couple conference calls with him. And when I published a few papers, he went through the papers and read them back to me and commented on them as he went through them, which was really a wonderful process to really hear him digest your own thinking and then feed it back from his perspective. And he wasn't being paid to do something like that. That was I think a real generous gift of his time to take the time with every author that was engaging with his ideas and to digest them, appreciatively reflect on them, and then feed back in such a thoroughgoing way. So, I think there's, when I teach Ken Wilber's material in university, a lot of people immediately have this reaction of him as arrogant, of a guy who puts his head everywhere, his bald face everywhere. And, there's a certain preconceptions that I think make it harder for that, I think, authentic transmission of really where he's coming from to come through. And yeah, I know people who've worked with him and say he can be difficult at times to work in organizational settings and things like that. But my experience of him is of being really deeply encouraging and open-hearted with other individuals who are looking at these ideas, not just looking at the ideas to parrot them and then forward them and enrich him, but really interested in these ideas. And he's encouraging, in my experience of him, of the creative application and extension of these things beyond where he's presented them. So I've really appreciated that openness and that encouraging quality in him, and getting a better sense of his humor and the things that he cares about. And I think that really does help in reading this. So not everyone has that, but at least we can maybe try to hold some of that as we go through this.
Yeah, and I would just add that it's not just the positive appreciations of a person. Like you mentioned, people have had difficulties with him, right? I think is the total complex character of the human being is what makes it much easier to understand the deep structures they're trying to communicate, if they're trying to communicate deep structures.
Right, right.
This document, sort of to get us underway here, it starts off with this stuff about an integral age at the leading edge, something like that. And, I'm always a little bit suspicious of statistics concerning how many people are at what stage, right? Where did the number 2% come from for the integral people?
Yeah.
What is that number pointing to? Is it one thing or a bunch of things? Where is it sourced? Right. But aside from reasonable quibbles like that, I think it's pretty reasonable to say that a small but not insignificant percentage of healthy, well-experienced human beings today feel like they could only make sense of the world through something that's evolving and inside and outside and personal and social and integrates alternative perspectives and states of mind to make them all work better without canceling any of them. So I think that's pretty solid. And the number 2% feels like it roughly symbolizes that territory. And then there's this notion that 25% of people are pluralistic, cultural creatives. Now, that number's probably wide of the mark, I think, right? If you got a bunch of voters who say they're very concerned about the environment and gay marriage and racism, doesn't necessarily mean they're authentically generating those positions in themselves. They might be on a team that uses those concepts as a flag. They might be liberal modernist game players who think you have to stick to the messaging in order to professionally manipulate public opinion. There's lots of different ways that people holding those positions might not really be in that space. But same with the 2%, there's a sense in which it creatively describes something that seems valid, that there's a chunk of pluralistic ecological thinkers out there. And it's larger than the integral chunk, even though it's smaller than the traditional and modern chunk. And I think there's an early optimism in this text, which is Wilber going, hey, this chunk exists of these pluralists. That's the immediately preceding zone to the integral thinking. And there's a bunch of them. So there could at any time be a sudden shift where a bunch of people enter the integrative headspace from out of the pluralistic headspace. So that's it's not necessary, but it's well within the realm of plausibility going forward, because you've got a bunch of kindling and you could get a fire if a match got to that kindling, and it's right there near the match. So I think that's it's a unique way to be positive in this document right at the beginning.
I agree that there is that potential, and I think he focuses on sociology and kind of the evolution of sociological schools and what seems to have put them at the edge of a more integral expression. And I think we can find the same thing in psychology. That's where I focus in my own work teaching. And nowadays, few therapists consider themselves aligned with a single school. Most of them might have a general leaning in one direction or another, but would self-describe as eclectic in that they see value in multiple different, psychotherapeutic modalities and framings, and they draw on them as they can to navigate the complex territory of people's lives. So there's already a validation of the partial truths, at least, of multiple different psychological frames and approaches. That puts it right at the edge of, an integral reorientation, that, you can see that the conditions are ripe for people to want to take that further step into seeing more of the deep structure that can unify or at least productively correlate the different therapeutic schools. So yeah, I think that's encouraging, and I think that's grounded and real, whether the percentages are on the mark or not.
Yeah, there's that's what I said to myself when I was reading it. The door to the leading edge is open, and there's a lot of people milling about in the waiting room. there's definitely some potential there. You mentioned the sociology, and maybe you'll analogize it to psychology a little bit more. But he does an interesting thing in the next section, which is to look at what I would call the sub-stages of the emergence of systems thinking, which is sort of a micro-analysis of the transitions across the pluralistic territory within narrative space. And so he starts out, initially, there's a kind of structuralist, functionalist attempt to grapple with what linear mechanistic science has been producing. So it's like the first sort of reflective phase on what science and modern systems have been doing. And it kind of describes a really complex circuit board. It's like a static systems theory. He says, there's a great meme in there where he says, your systems theory is a Republican in drag.
Yeah, right.
I like that, right? So we would consider that fairly conservative, this position of many people who think they're imagining the world in complex, dynamic ways. Their dynamism is really a static dynamism.
Mm-hmm.
And so what you get is super modernism rather than postmodernism. You get the errors of the linear mechanistic model amplified with a bigger toolkit that comes from just having all these functional systems to look at now.
Right.
And so that dominates. I think Wilber calls them the elite cognitive institutions for just a generation or two, because very quickly those institutions fill up with people who want to say, yeah, that's still too much like the old mechanistic way to do it. We need to be thinking of dynamic intercontextual functionalisms. So now we're multicultural, we're pluralistic, we're relativistic, and all of our big-mouthed leading thinkers are coming from that perspective, and that becomes like postmodernism proper. And when he talks about it really centrally as being a shift toward things like microsociology, I associate that with Nietzsche saying new histories have to come, right? We not just the histories of politics and war, but the histories of things that seemed marginalized or too small or too ordinary to have been tracked. They all have to become microanalyzed as part of our living history. And that the new pluralistic mode is kind of an ingredients consciousness. Instead of looking at all the options on the modern menu, all of those functional systems, now we want to know what it's made of. Where did it come from, right? Is this salad organic? Is this ethically sourced? Are there probiotics in this? So I think that trickles out into the rest of the culture, and it creates a vast moving set of dynamic contextual relationships, which then can only be solved by a third phase of systems thinking, which is some kind of perspectival integration, which allows these to all be what they are without being trivialized and yet work together, much in the same way that Einstein was able to bring together all the different relativistic forms of measurement making into a single coherent system, more or less. So I think that's what he's trying to say that he's doing, and what this document is doing, and also what we've been doing, because I couldn't help thinking metaphysics of adjacency when I looked at it, because those intercontextual relationships, which are constantly changing, are not something that undoes or just challenges the old solid thinking. It's actually the bricks of the new cathedral. It's a reliable feature. If you see it everywhere, these intercontextual dynamics, you go, oh, in order to really make a functional systems theory, it has to be built out of changing dynamic intercontextual relations, which is what Wilber's been doing for decades.
Yeah, I think the appeal to Nietzsche is appropriate, with the microsociology, and he names a number of related disciplines, but you could take the Nietzschean notion of genealogy and kind of apply that across multiple fields, where it's looking at the genetic origination of multiple kinds of patterns and forms and systems. And then, like you're saying, the next move is not only to deconstruct present structures through a genealogical analysis, but to understand basically that whole dynamic movement and their intercontextuality and their adjacency and the potential integral relationships that can be, perceived for them. And I think in the next section, he really begins to lay out some of the you could say, metaphysical architecture for that, where he's looking, starting in a way with Whitehead's model of prehensive unification, but expanding that out to what is like a 4-quadrant, an AQAL tetrahension that he talks about, and really looking, with the cross being in some way those adjacency points, right, of that dynamic genealogical flowering. So yeah, I think there's a lot in what he's doing in that next section, drawing on Whitehead and expanding that relates to a number of things in terms of his understanding of postmetaphysics and integral methodological pluralism and his social analyses and other things. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in diving a little bit into that inheritance of the past model that he's looking at in that next section of the document.
It's very, this text is Derrida meets Whitehead in many respects, Yeah. And he goes into the the metaphysical shift or the post-metaphysical shift he's trying to make in this document in that next section, when he tries to start saying, okay, so if there's this third phase of systems thinking, what does the world look like there? Right. And what stood out to me is he immediately goes to Aurobindo, because he wants to start talking about, as we know from talking to him the other day, he thinks a kind of morphological spectrum that underlies and skews adaptive evolutionary outcomes is an essential feature of establishing any kind of functional meta theory. Although the traditional way, and this is where invoking Aurobindo comes in, the traditional way is to assume that as an eternal pre-given structure. And that was certainly the assertion made by the great transrational mystics and the integrative supermap makers of history. Was just always is like that. So that's the ladder we crawl back up. And I think Wilber is very open to that possibility. But in this section, he's going to say, we don't have to think of it that way, right? There's another option, which is to think of this in a Sheldrake fashion as a probabilistic accumulation of habits produced over history. And I think he says and this is where it gets close to what we're working on, a post-metaphysical reconstruction of spiritual traditions, right? How can we talk about all of those structures perceived by and apparently utilized by the great mystics in a way that doesn't assume them as all inherently eternal and pre-given, right? Is there a way to establish involutionary givens through evolutionary creativity and adaptation? So the argument is going to be that historical inventions or discoveries in all of these different domains, social and physical, material, psychological, are going to set up grooves. And the longer these grooves stay in play in one particular fashion, the more they come to constrain and enable the possibilities of whatever can come next. And this builds up into something that looks like and functions exactly like that metaphysical ladder, if it's understood in a minimal sense of structures that skew the probabilities of the outcomes of the world toward these particular qualitative thresholds. So it's a very interesting way to preserve some of the deep metaphysics of spiritual history in a way that sounds like quantum mechanics, right? If it's a probabilistic search for the tendencies of the electron, why not a probabilistic search for the tendencies of God?
Right. Yeah, and you may not have gone through the footnotes in the document, but in footnote 26, he gives some ground to still the Aurobindian involutionary givens. So part of what his project here is, and what he emphasizes in the main document, is how many of the things that we have taken as given in classical metaphysics can actually be shown to be emergent evolutionary habits and emergent evolutionary forms that are conceived not as just pre-existing structures that are waiting out there for people to come upon, but, as you've just been mentioning, a kind of probability space for the manifestation of certain forms and patterns in any given, space-time configuration. And so he lays out a lot like that, and he can draw on Peirce's notion of cosmic habits, or Sheldrake's morphogenetic articulation of that. But he still points back to certain things like number and causality and other things like that as necessary elements in the very syntax of being itself that had to be laid down or had to be kind of inherited before even the Big Bang could unfold the way it did. So he would say there are some parts that are built into the whole unfolding from the beginning, but other parts are legitimately better seen as emergent evolutionary forms.
That's a creative tension that I think really establishes the frame for a lot of the work that you and I have done with adjacency and prepositionality. Because if you take the majority of the structures of reality, including many that were thought to be part of the metaphysics of the universe, and say that they are probabilistic emergent habits, which is to say they're not real or real, they're grouped up towards something, they're proximal.
Yeah.
Right. And then you can look and say, well, yes, but don't there have to be a minimum set of involutionary givens that are presupposed or implied by any kind of universe in order to make any of this possible? You say, well, yes, okay, absolutely. We want that to be as minimal as possible, though, and not confused with subjective or mythic visions necessarily. But you can build those structures by a certain shift of your thinking out of the same kind of proximal distributions that we see in a probabilistic emergent evolutionary universe. You say that dynamic of relational intercontextual proximity is the thing out of which the involutionary ontology is built. Then you have coherence across both of these options, and they can both be in play without being metaphysically asserted in the old fashion.
Right. And there's a open kind of cosmological question there if you really consider Whitehead's notion of prehensive unification. And are those elements that are involutionarily given, are they involutionarily given from timelessness, or are they involutionarily given from possibly other universes that pre-existed the unfolding of this one? Sure. Is there also the prehensive unfolding of universes through time without necessarily bottoming it out in some void space that where everything is eternally pre-given?
Well, this is certainly what Roger Penrose has been arguing lately, which is that from previous cycles of the Big Bounce, you could actually see certain distribution skewings in the gravitational arrangement of things in our cosmos that wouldn't make any sense unless they'd been established by a universe prior to the Big Bang.
Right.
So I think a lot of people are, whatever turns out to be the case, a lot of people are feeling their way into this kind of thinking.
I think if you're interested in that, I want to just do a little focus on Whitehead and what's going on there, and then that kind of we can then show better what Wilber is doing with his,
Sure.
quadratic
bring the prehension, Bruce.
Yeah. So, with me, with my integral grammatology, I like to look at the different metaphysics, and, Whitehead is slippery. He's not exactly strictly a process philosopher, but he's a process philosopher, but he's a process relational philosopher. And so that's verbal and prepositional, but to me, there's also this adverbial component in him of looking at the basically the eternal ideas that give rise to kind of his own Platonic framing of things. So generally, in process-oriented views, there's a sense that we have pre-given to us this flow of becoming, this continuous flow of becoming. And this will, I think, relate to some of our talk recently about the elusive I and some other things. But there's this continual flow of becoming. And in a model that starts from a continuous flow of becoming, it's hard to account for an abiding sense of self. If everything is just constantly slipping away and never itself, if you use something like Bohm's model of the whirlpool, where it looks like it's the same thing because it maintains a similar form, but actually it's never the same thing. It's constantly just an ongoing flow. In a way, it's hard to necessarily account for the sense of an abiding identity. One way that Abhidharma Buddhist traditions have done it, they would say there's a couple things going on that give us the sense of an abiding self. One is just the speed at which things are changing, that the arisings and the movements are too fast for untrained consciousness to pick up on. And so they look more constant. You know, you can't see the individual frames of the film, right? You just see, you know, what seems to be an abiding thing there. Also, we have memory. We're able to recall previous feelings and events. And third, whenever there's a moment of sense consciousness, that's often immediately followed by a moment of mental consciousness, and, you know, using the Abhidharma terms. And that immediate following gives a sense of relationship between them, or continuity between them. And so self in this framing would be mostly an illusion generated by epistemological features, including epistemological limitations and deficiencies. But ultimately, there's a way that we can refine attention down to the realization that there is no self. Now, you know, I think looking at what we talked about in the elusive I, there's some truth to that, but we maybe don't want to go so far that we erase any value to there being, you know, or reality to there being the perception of a self, right? And so how do you frame it and how do you look at it? And one of the ways that Whitehead has done it is that against most other process thinkers, he doesn't start out looking at reality or taking the flow of becoming, the continuous flow of becoming, to be the ontological ground. Instead, he starts from an atomistic or individualistic basis. And instead of the kind of the continuity of becoming, he talks more about the becoming of continuity, that the sense of continuity is an achievement. It's something that's realized in the activity of very transient, what he calls actual occasions, that reality consists of these transient, momentary experiences, forms of experience that, like a little bubble or flash of experience that contains two things at once. It's kind of split down the middle. On the one hand, that actual occasion consists of the prehension of the immediately preceding moments of experience. The feelings and elements of that previous moment are prehended now, and that becomes the structure of the present moment. And in that prehension, there's also this emergent spark of novelty, the showing up of something that hasn't been there before. And so there's this unfolding of prehensive unifications, and he doesn't conceive of an actual occasion as a totally isolated atomic unit that doesn't touch anything else. Rather, every actual occasion has lines of relationship that lead out into the rest of the cosmos. So you can see almost like an Indra's net-like picture where there's these threads and tentacles of relationship reaching everywhere, but there's these momentary prehensive unifications that capture, the immediately preceding moment of experience. And one of the problems with this, that I don't know if this is getting too much into the weeds, but one of the problems with this, that I think there are some object-oriented ontologists like Bryant and Harman and others who actually really resonate overall with Whitehead's notion of atomistic becoming beings that are related to other beings in some fundamental ways. But the object-oriented ontologists would argue that there has to be some element of that actual occasion that are withdrawn, that are not part of the prehensive moment. One way that you can get at that is if you look at information theory. Older forms of information theory, we thought of basically information being a meaning unit that's transferred from one thing to another thing intact. There's a signal that's a meaning unit, and it's here and it's transferred over here, and then you receive it. But second order, third order cybernetics doesn't look at things in that way anymore, especially with autopoietic and other kinds of unpackings, which Wilber's going to get into in later excerpts in a lot of detail. But if you think about information as basically having to do with difference, with differences that make a difference, that information is that which selects certain system structures, and that whatever is unfolded as a meaning, as a perception, is a unique fruit of the organization of the receiving element, so that what's received is not a straight transmission of an idea, but we're stimulated in a way so that our own self-organization gives rise to a meaningful perception, but that's internal to the structure of that occasion. And Whitehead kind of argues that an actual occasion is nothing other than its prehension of the previous moment. And Bryant and others would argue you can't really say that, because if information involves a difference that makes a difference, and if it's only the prehension of the previous moment, it's nothing in itself, and there's no structure in itself that could actually select certain states over others, or the whole way that we understand information processing to happen now. That's too spare of a description. There has to be some withdrawn or non-activated structures and elements in any occasion that actually have a structuring influence on what manifests. And Wilber gets at this too, and he points at that in a number of ways. But I think he's saying that one, that there has to be some parts of in an actual occasion that are not prehended, that are in the background. And I think overall the AQAL framing of that, and we can get into that, but the AQAL framing of that and the bringing in of Whitehead, I mean, not of Whitehead, of Sheldrake, might be, where we're talking about, morphic units and morphic resonance out that could be operative outside of the prehensive moment. Those things, I think, could resolve that problem in a way that, the Whiteheadian critics like Bryant and others haven't quite done yet. Wilber's offering his own way towards that. So I don't know if there's any thread in there you want to pick up on. I know it was a big dump right there. So
that's too many. There's too many in there. It seems like one of the things Wilber's doing here is trying to accommodate the potential limitation of something in Whitehead, right? Which I think is the framing of objective enfolding subjective. Essentially, something starts to enter reality as your experience and ends up being something that you have experienced and you are enfolding. And that relationship between those features, I think Wilber wants to say that's not where the prehension is occurring. The prehension is kind of perpendicular to that. It's simultaneously occurring in both the subjective and objective and intersubjective and interobjective domains. They're all prehending their own type of thing together all the time. So I often come back to to pi, right? Pi is a distinct, well-known heuristic description of a set of relationships that apply over all the different kinds of circles, but it's a discrete thing. It's an identity. It's like a self. And you go, now, well, if I want to precisely describe what that is, I'm going to need an infinite non-repeating set of digital numbers. It withdraws completely from this other process. And it describes, I think, how the self can be completely real as pi and yet vanishes when you start to do the analysis. Doesn't mean it's not there. Those elements are not, they're not enfolding each other. They're simultaneously present and they're each being enfolded in their own domain. And I think that's what Wilber wants to say here. He's looking for a word. He postulates tetrahension or whatever, which is never going to catch on. Quadratic prehension kind of looks nice written on the page, but it's a little clumsy too. But he's saying there needs to be a way of thinking about how at least 4 ways of being in the world are simultaneously prehending what they inherit and not prehending each other. Right? So it's not that the thing that is specified by the infinite withdrawal of the object is somehow lost and prehended by the notion of the thing that we're experiencing because it's now in my experience, right? Those are not rivals. Those are complementary teammates, each advancing in their own domain, in their own style. So I think that's one of the things Wilber seems most excited about returning to again and again in this text.
Yeah, very much so. And for me, the wild knot is my way of talking about what you mean by pi. And the wild knot also recedes, when you're looking and trying to find it, it recedes infinitely. And that can connect to Whitehead's intuition of an unfolding of relational lines indefinitely out into the cosmos. But at the same time, even into itself, you can follow it down without, it ever approaching an absolute zero, right? There's no final terminus point to the knot. And so I think, that's very interesting. One thing that, there's a number of things to look at here. This is maybe just a little side thing. He's looking very much at, how the model of prehension that Whitehead put forward, and Wilber is situating it in mostly the upper left and to some degree in the lower left, that there's basically the inheritance of every moment by every individual actual occasion, but there's also the inheritance, the kind of the cultural memory. I want to come back to that a little bit later, but in the lower left, that there's a habitus and cultural memory. There's things that basically go into the constitution and reconstitution, reenactment of cultural forms as well as individual forms, through this prehensive movement. And one of the things that he talks about is that, and he was saying this is Whitehead's answer to Hume, is that because every moment is a little bit like the past moment, that the past moment informs, and you can look at that both at the level of information, but also as structuring, that every past moment informs the present moment. There's a kind of real causation that happens, which he calls, one way to look at it as karma, but there's a real causation that happens in that internal domain. And I was thinking again about object-oriented ontology and what they've been playing with, and I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, but Morton argues that causation is aesthetic, that causation is an aesthetic domain thing, that especially if you think about objects as withdrawing, as having that receding pi, there's some way that the substance of the objects never touch. They meet in front of themselves in the shining display of their phenomenal presentation. And it's in that apprehension, that prehension of those phenomenal forms that some causative influence happens. And so I would say, I don't know if they've really followed that out. I haven't read enough of Morton to know, but it seems to me that the way that Wilber is presenting this, he is, at least for the left-hand quadrants, talking about causation as a kind of aesthetic phenomenon. And if you then also look over to the right hand where he's talking about formative causation, say where, a string is vibrated, and if there's another string that, is at the same tension, it will vibrate too. Once this one starts vibrating, then this one, and them vibrating together is morphic resonance. And the fact that one starts vibrating in response to the activity of the other is formative causation. And in that musical kind of metaphor, there's again, even though it's in third person terms, something very aesthetic about that responding of form to form, that still, gives an aesthetic quality to the account of causation that Wilber's kind of laying out. And Harman goes in the direction of like Islamic occasionalism, that, things don't ever directly act on each other, but there's always causation is always mediated, right? So anyway, that might be a side thing, not worth exploring too much, but it was one thought that came up there.
Well, one of the things that reminds me of is the discussions we have around different grammar type modalities of processing things, right? So I think to treat causality as if it were aesthetics, as if it were a stylistic phenomenon, is a very good thing in terms of adverbs and adjectives, right? Mm-hmm. But we could also treat it in a verbal mode or a nounal mode or something like that. And the example of the vibrating strings, I think, really brings that home, which is you can treat it as two discrete things just resonating in terms of their form, or you can do an analysis of the causal transmission chain from one to the other and back again. And I think that is an option you have at every scale of analyzing the cosmos and in every domain and thematic zone as well of analyzing the cosmos. So I think we always seem to have these basic modal opportunities to translate it different ways, and they should be seen as anticipated and complementary. One of the things Wilber touches on a lot, which is implied in a bunch of Sheldrake's solutions to these things, is this notion that the hypothesis, I think, that the older a habit, the more ingrained it is. Mm-hmm. Right. So there's this sense that matter has less wiggle room than biology in terms of its morphic informational regime, that the specific style that hominids used in their archaic intelligence is much older and therefore much more fixed than the specific style of the still emerging pluralistic, right? That postmodernism with another generation of different parenting or different diet or something, postmodernism might look very different, but archaic is always going to look the way it looked because it's been doing it for a very long time. And that's an interesting hypothesis. I don't know what the data is for it, one way or the other. I'm curious what your take is on the assumption that seems to pervade this work, that the longer it's been in play, the more fixed it is.
Yeah, I don't know if I have any evidence I could marshal one way or the other, or even very strong logical arguments about it. I note that he talks about how certain forms, once they find basically the right four-quadrant fit with their, with their overall ecological niche, that they can remain remarkably constant for millions of years. There are different organisms that once they've been established, they just keep doing that. They keep reenacting their form again and again for millions of years. So I think it's one of those things like non-locality in physics. Whether you can fully explain it, it seems to be presented as a phenomenal fact.
There are very old, very consistent forms.
Right.
Whether they're more consistent because they're older is an open question.
That's right. Right. Yeah, it may be that just certain conditions have been constant enough to allow them not to have to change, right? It's not that there's something intrinsic to them that they don't change, but that there's been at least enough of an island of stability in multiple AQAL factors that it's been allowed.
It could also be a pace layering issue, right? We don't see with our senses the continents moving, but they are.
Mm-hmm.
They are changing. They're just changing at a different rate than us.
Right. Yeah, that's true. There's something in his discussion of, you don't know if we maybe move on to some other stuff in a little bit about, Marxism or meaning crisis or other things, but just in this discussion of the inheritance of the past, and he's dwelling a bit on the lower left version of that. And, I think, especially with something like epigenetics, that may be something that we can look at in terms of both individually and collectively, how the past is inherited in the present. I was thinking just of it's much easier to encounter, I think, the cultural memories or the cultural moods as an outsider than to find them in your own culture. You might find it in yourself and in your own way of being if you insert yourself in a foreign place, or you might find something over there. And I was thinking of my experiences in Korea, and one of the things that the Koreans note as
South Korea, I'm assuming.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, in South Korea is the notion, but actually this concept crosses both sides of the border, and that's this concept of Han. And they have a couple words for Han. Han is one way that they talk about Korea itself. It's Hanguk is the Korean word for themselves, their country. But Han is a unique feeling that Koreans feel that they have that most other people don't have. And there's no clear translation of it, at least into English. It's a mixture of resentment and sorrow and a feeling of helplessness under injustices from a greater power and a sadness tinged with hope. So it's a whole kind of like soupy emotional form that they recognize as unique to their character. And they dwell on it as like the beauty of sorrow. And their pansori music is one of the main vehicles for expressing that. But early Westerners, like back in 1907, when we were kind of like really beginning to interface with the Koreans, it really stood out as a mood that just was strikingly different, that kind of permeated the cultural sphere.
It's a shared interior enfolding of many other shared interior experiences that have come before it.
Exactly. Yeah, they see it deeply rooted in their own history of multiple sequences of conquest by the Chinese and the Japanese. It's only recently that they're coming into their own, and it'd be interesting to see how that feeling of Han is shifting and changing in recent decades. But to me, it was a good example of that inheritance of the past that comes to constitute and inform a whole cultural way of being.
The Ken's typical quadrant insistence, which permeates this document, bridges between his metaphysical examination, try to update the Whiteheadian thing, and also his current social analysis segment in this document. He uses a phrase selection pressures in all quadrants, which I like. The idea that truth and truthfulness and fitness and meaning making are not only all valid, but they're all complementary, reciprocally sustaining facets of a regime or an operating system, especially when it is getting itself established. Although, when I remember that I used to think of the specific systems virtue as fitness, but I don't so much anymore, because obviously material objects also have a fitness quality. I know a lot of people talk about the lower right systems virtue as justice, but that has to be specified as only one type of justice, not everything we mean by whether something feels just. So I typically go to leverage or parsimony now as the virtue by which the capacity of interbehavioral systems to extend greater effects over larger ranges using fewer inputs is established. That the inequity between the input and the output of a system is what's good for systems. But like any of the other virtues, it's not that great on its own. That's a bit of a digression. I was trying to talk about the four quadrants and how they come into the social analysis. And Wilber does a lot of praising Karl Marx in this document and saying, here's what Marx's specific genius was. He did this, he saw this, he saw this. In particular, he is affirmative of the sense that cultural psychology is always deeply coupled with the economic material base. And he's very appreciative of the observation that there are social tensions or contradictions between the psychology afforded by new technologies and the residual consciousness of the power structures coming out of a previous regime. But what Wilber wants to do is expand that into a multi-quadrant framework, and a multi-level framework. So you have multiple different epistemic psychologies, all vying with each other at different scales. And you have not just the problem of the getting a cultural psychology out of a material economic base, but of those being always coupled and influencing each other while being influenced in another direction as well. So that the individuals and the group think and the things we have and the way we go about organizing ourselves are all coupled and mutually influencing each other across these zones of often hidden tension between different epistemic groups within the system that are adapted to different degrees of technological updating.
Yeah, I appreciated that, his argument that basically we can't just assume naively that any culture has a singular techno-economic base with a singular superstructure, but that usually, especially maybe it's getting much more difficult as we proceed decade by decade, there's a greater layering of techno-economic bases and cultural superstructures. And there might be a dominant one, but there's a whole nesting of them, and they interact with each other. And so his expansion of that to me was a really valuable contribution. I don't know the degree to which current Marxists are taking that into account or not, but to me it seems a very reasonable point to make. And I'm thinking about Rifkin here, and also about Greg and his notion of the different joint points and what needs to come together for a shift to another cultural mode of being. And following Marx, he talks a lot about the techno-economic base. The reason one thing I'm just mentioning here is with Rifkin, one of the things that he points out is that those epical cultural transformations don't happen just in relation to basically technology and and economics, but also communication systems. And that it's when those things align, kind of the techno-economic structures, the means of energy production and wealth distribution, and the forms of communication, whether it's oral or beginning to be, cuneiform, written or published, text that could be in everybody's hand, or now the internet. There's an evolution in. You could say that's a technological thing, but I think it's useful to look at it as its own domain. The regimes of communication within a system that allow it, you could say, to be autopoetically linked in certain ways and allow for greater degrees of sophistication or not. And the argument then right now, and why we're feeling in part a disjunction between superstructure and what's emerging, is that we have an older form of, kind of older techno-economic base that's still operating, while the communication system has leapt ahead with the internet and everything that's going on there, but they're not aligned yet. And that's one disjunction that's creating disharmony in the system. And, one of Wilber's big points in the selection pressures, if the holon is not able, whether it's a social holon or individual, when the holon is not able to bring those over time into a constructive alignment, it's at risk. Its survival is at risk. So what we're looking at now in part is, can we bring up our means of energy production, for instance, to the next level, to be on par with the emergent communication system?
Yeah, getting those balances right is a key moral concern in this text, right? So, but Marx looks at it as if the techno-material economic base was the only causality line and everything else was downstream. Wilber's saying typically yes, but the causality stream is coming in, being prehended in these other three zones at the same time. And in order to establish an up-to-date cultural regime, you have to have all four of them online. And if you don't, then you're going to get an enormous amount of turbulence between the different systems that are vying for control of the culture. It reminds me a lot of, I don't know if you ever read, Santayana has a book on politics, the philosophy of politics. And one section that really impressed me was his analysis of the difference between the monarch and the tyrant. And the difference is the monarch inherits his tyranny from some other monarchs, and the tyrant is establishing a new hereditary set of tyrannies. And so the difference in the feeling is between the one that is appropriate to a relatively stable universe. And if something changes in the people or the technology or the economic relations, the means of production, all that stuff, then you need to replace a lineage of monarchs with a new lineage of monarchs that's up to speed, or is it responding to the current situation? And that's what the tyrant is. The tyrant is the update process of monarchy lineages. And so there's a story there about what Wilber in this text calls lag. He discusses the increasing technological depth leads to a lag in which the personal and social psychology is not up to speed. And that's, I think, what he's saying. That's what Marx is looking at, right? Marx is very, very aware that the new technological and information realities of the 1880s, or whatever the heck he was working, they can enable a real transformation and improvement of distributed human well-being, but the inherited social and psychological protocols are causing that to be a regenerative form of oligarchy and servitude. Mm-hmm. So there's a disjunction between the superstructure and the base, and that creates a contradiction that's going to lead to reform and revolution or disaster. And Wilber's saying, yes, and that's happening in multiple ways all over the place. So how do we get the leading edge balanced in these four zones and up to speed so that we can have a fairly nice revolutionary reform and not a catastrophic breakdown? Because I think that's what he's saying is going on, right? That the crisis is underway. These systems are not accommodating each other. The fifth factor, the pressure from pluralistic and integrative possibilities, is causing a little bit of destabilization, but the modern system is illegitimate on its own terms. And this is going to produce a collapse unless these four zones stabilize a reliable version of the leading edge.
And it's really an open question. How do you do that?
Yeah.
Right? What are the next steps, especially when there are significant resistances to innovations in certain fields, both at the cultural level, but even at the technological level? If there's a significant investment in one way of doing things that maybe hasn't yielded the full amount of profit yet, there may be resistance to moving to the next regime before the usefulness of the former one has been maximized. Is there a way to, that to me is also just like, even within, one piece of the puzzle, there's tension right there, a levels tension.
I don't know. That's the unanswered question in the text for sure, is how we pull this off, because there are so many game A problems that can go wrong here, right? Even if you, like, let's say, even if 98% of the countries in the world were able to pull that off, and the only two countries that didn't were the United States and China, then we probably all still go down. So there's huge ranges of interactive complexity problems here, not just getting those things online, but getting them online together in a way that can be the new hegemony in a sense. And so it has to be able to displace the previous hegemony, which means that replacing and critiquing modernity's structural failures in its delegitimation mode, because Wilber talks a lot about a legitimation crisis where the structures of the system are no longer functioning. Modern citizens have lost trust in modern institutions, right? All the modern things are being hacked by the modern players as a matter of course, disrupting the system everywhere. And it seems like no horizontal change, party switching, president switching, university switching is solving any of the accumulating problems. So the modern system, and I would argue this is inherent to modernity, that it's got a set of incentives that always self-sabotage, but nonetheless, it's in a non-legitimate mode. And we have to really understand, A, why it's in that mode, what modernity does insufficiently or wrong that leads to this, and B, what it does right so that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So that very serious ambidextrous critique of modern systems has to go on, and a massive implementation of at least pluralistic functional systems has to be brought online at a large scale very rapidly and over a wide enough swath of the global population that nobody who doesn't play can sabotage it for everybody else. And we all have to get there psychologically and emotionally and figure out how to interact with each other in this kind of a universe in a way that can either come online fast enough for people in communities or be nice enough to the parts that aren't yet up to speed that they don't revolt against it and sabotage the whole process. So that's a huge ask.
It is. And there's a tension I've noticed in the text a little bit, where he talks about how postmodernism and other approaches have tended to privilege a quadrant and show that the causative, influence flows primarily from this one domain out to the rest, and that what he's proposing is this mutuality of influence and arising together. But one way he kind of presents it as it all arises at once, and it's almost an acausal presentation of it, that they all arise at once. At other points, he does talk about how he grants that Marx is right, that there is a strong influence of the techno-economic base and that sort of thing on the overall psyche of the people and the emergent culture. So I see him kind of like, on the one hand, wanting to almost do a acausal presentation of the unfolding of the quadrants, and two, talk about their intra-quadrant influences on each other. To me, this is where, we're plugging our own stuff in this conversation, but to me, this is where what we're working on, I think, can make a contribution in terms of thinking about, the types of adjacencies, the type of relationships, the type of prepositional vectors and causative influences that could be present in any tetra-arising situation. Just in saying that a holon, has a tendency to exist and manifest in a particular way in a certain space-time mode. I'm going, I know, kind of away from the sociological back to the metaphysical, but it's going to come back to that. That arising in a particular space-time mode is already framing it in the next to domain, in the kind of stuff that we've been wanting to look at through adjacency, prepositionality, adverbiality. So these are kind of contextualizing factors, in a sense, in the enactment of any holonic actual occasion.
The tension or seeming contradiction in this writing and a lot of Wilbur stuff around how cooperatively balanced these quadrants have to be with each other, right? Are they always all co-arising, or do we frequently get problems where one or two of them are present and the other ones are missing? And I think his attempt to answer is to put it in, let's say, specific space-time modes, that this occurs in certain moments or at certain thresholds where they're necessarily tetrameshed. And then outside of those necessities, there is a lot of flexibility in whether they're tetrameshed or not. Right. And I think of, I don't know if you see my pictures of what I call the coaxial model, where I tease apart the differentiation range from the integration. Mm-hmm. So someone's going along and they're expanding their range of detectable possible types of patterns. And then when they enter that, when they upgrade to the new regime, right, when we go through a period in our life where we think, oh, now I get a whole new way of seeing, and everything seems super connected for a while, and then that kind of wears off sometimes. We still have the structure, we still see things that way, but our sense of how intensely integrated everything has receded. So it's like we're moving along in this direction of evolution, but there's a spike there when the new regime is established in ourselves or in the world. And Wilber says that these correspondences only have to be there right at the beginning, right? So like right at the beginning of postmodernism, postmodern concepts and phrases are coming out of actual postmodernists. Mm-hmm. But as soon as you pass that threshold, anybody can use postmodern phrases and concepts. It doesn't mean they're postmodern at all.
Right.
So there's a coming together tetrameshing and a coming apart, and how to get them together to enable the next phase shift is the question. So most of the time, I think he's saying they're not together, but getting them together is essential to having them be in the mode of production of a stable new regime.
There's something of a suggestion of like a panarchy cycle in that, where there's the coming together in a mutual fit of elements that allow for a condition of thriving. There's this kind of arc in consolidation where it moves into even a kind of conservative mode, where there's an attempt to preserve what's emerged, and then there's a procession gradually towards disjunctions and imbalances that eventually undermines the whole ecological system and leads to a period of dissolution until there can be again another reconstitution. So that panarchy cycle constantly flowing through, basically there's like 4 points there that I think we could look at that productively.
Yeah, that the panarchy cycle haunts me a little bit, because I spend time looking at the self-destabilization functions of modernity. Now, doesn't mean there aren't self-destabilization functions in all the other first tier or game A systems. It's just that my current universe is dominated by the modern system's hegemon to some degree, and that's what we're all facing. But the idea that all of them go through a cycle like that is very fascinating and very consonant with what we see in the biological world.
Mm-hmm.
I guess we've roughly gone through the sociological thing here. I wanted to say that, whether it's Jeremy Johnson's integral left or the kind of radical thoughts of a Burge and a Cooper, everything I would call the expressions of a meta progressive urgency,
Mm-hmm.
are really presaged, are really anticipated in many respects by this document and by what Wilber calls in this document revolutionary integral pluralism.
Right.
And that's he's calling out a political possibility for integral culture that addresses the current moment, that is inherently integral, inherently pluralistic, and inherently revolutionary. Even though, as he says, the revolution could be dramatic reforms, doesn't have to be complete disaster or destabilization, but what does not bend will break. If you can't get the revolution done through the reforms, then the revolution will be more radical. But the revolution, in his eyes, has to occur. It's a very, very revolutionary document. It surprised me in that sense.
Yeah, and I appreciated there where he talked about, again, drawing on Whitehead and the prehensive unification of actual occasions, where there's both the prehending of the past, but there's also that creative emergence of novelty. And it's that little emergent niche that allows the system basically, possibly, to funnel itself, some of the forces, creative forces of the system, if there's the, you could say the right attractive elements and the right, coming together of elements, that little bubble, that little envelope of possibility that can emerge is that revolutionary moment that can, so I think that's what, in a way, he's calling for is the cohering of new cultural nodes that could serve as attractors. If people can see, promise there in the midst of the disjunction and dysfunction of the present systems.
And because of this argument that more recently emergent operating systems have more wiggle room in terms of how they will end up manifesting, there's a sense in which the pluralistic and especially the integral could still go a number of different ways. And when I first read this years ago, it would not have stood out to me as such a political document, right? The phrase revolutionary integral pluralism wouldn't have meant to me then what it means to me now. And it may be that there is some sort of shifting, right? There's a new set of feelings about what integral could be, which is precisely what this document specifies, right? That there's a range of stylistic modalities by which the new thing you were just discussing could show up. And as a result, it can accommodate a lot of the critiques and complaints, many of which are moral critiques and complaints that people have been making for the last 20 or 30 years since this theory has been explicit, right? That we can say it's got to be more, it's got to be more gender balanced. It's got to be more urgent. It's got to be more ecologically revolutionary. It's got to be more critical of the current economic system, right? So there's these things that have become very overtly part of the zeitgeist in these last couple of decades, more so than they were before, and that these can still imprint themselves on what the definition of the post-pluralistic consciousness is going to look like. So that fascinates me.
It was just making me think. I listened the other day to Bayo Akamolafe talking about kind of his own revolutionary vision. And one of the things that he called, basically calling for sanctuary. But one of the things that he, I would say, called for is a stepping outside of the systems and structures that are existing in order to establish something new. He's in a way talking about inhabiting a new kind of niche, and that there's a way of participating in the system. And he told some stories about some people who escaped from slavery, but in the very way that they took steps to escape from their enslaved condition, they actually, in a way, reinforced the whole slave system structure.
Yeah.
And that there's a need sometimes to step outside of participation in that whole regime. And he's basically calling for that, for people to get adjacent to our ecological and, global political systems and begin to enact something different, which to me also puts me in mind of like Alistair McIntyre. And he's also suggesting something like that, that we need the emergence of new micro communities that are operating on different grounds from, kind of they're getting off the grid metaphorically, and they begin to enact other potentials. Benita Roy talks about different ways to go meta. One is to leap above it, but one is to go in a direction that is just to step outside of that game. That's what object-oriented ontology did. It saw the whole game of, kind of postmodern philosophical discourse and analytic discourse. And it just, instead of trying to like fix any of those things or resolve them, it said, let's just step over here and see what happens if we make this lateral adjacent kind of move. And so I think that's in itself a revolutionary movement. And, so I'm hearing Alistair and Bio and other people all talking about that, even Joe Lightfoot with his, neo-tribalism and his, that there's this, how can we slip between and outside of the present systems in order to enact new possibilities that are emergent, that are actually arising in some way out of what's present, but are also captured to such a significant degree by what's present that you might need, like, what Washburn talks about, that what's necessary for the formation of the new human, of the growth of the ego, is that you're embedded in the whole dynamic ground of the mother-child system. And there's some way in which it's overwhelming, and a kind of repression barrier needs to be set in place so that some of those overwhelming influences can be damped, and what has been inherited from the riches of that can unfold in a new way without being overpowered by the influences of the massive structures that support it. So there's this necessary prodigal movement that I think more and more we should look at, and I think Game B and other communities are beginning also to look in that direction.
Well, along this theme, it seems to me there are three productive areas for a meta-progressive politics, which is also integral: revolutionary pluralism or revolutionary integrative pluralism, whatever we want to call it, because the first thing strikes me as the Brent Cooper argument, and this is similar to what I was just saying. There's still wiggle room to decide how these things go forward from among the existing thematic options, right? That there's a lot of things that are essential to establishing the healthy preconditions out of which novelty could be positive rather than merely disruptive, that we need to set up now. And we have on the table a number of different political and social moods and concern sets that we could go forward with. And one of them looks like it's concerned with establishing general human well-being in terms of multidimensionality and ecology and economy and coming disaster structures. So we need to lean into that one and try to make that one color as much of the emergence as possible. There's the, let's call it the Steve McIntosh issue, which is you've got to set things up that have as many of the existing value structures integrated together and in play together as possible, and make that be the basis of cultural conversations. And I would argue you have to do it with imagery and mood and tone as much as discussion. But then there's this third area, which is you have to keep the leading edge leading by constantly opening up new space. And, I think Deleuze and Guattari were talking about that in terms of schizoanalysis and the notion of the schizophrenic as a potential model that could be rehabilitated for social change, because the image there is the schizophrenic always doesn't answer the categories of the question.
Right.
You ask about something and they're already telling you their pants are on fire. So this sense that you want to constantly deviate from the established meaning categories, because that maximizes your chance of opening up the novel space where more integrative regimes might actually emerge from. I think the surrealists were doing that as well. They talked about the l'acte gratuit, the free action, and about a redefining beauty as being like the chance meeting of an umbrella and a sewing machine on a dissecting table. That surprise was going to be their definition of aesthetic positives. So I think a number of different really good European theorists, and also now a number of people all over, are seeing the need for that third form, which is to keep the leading edge alive by continually opening it up.
Yeah. Marilyn Hamilton talks about that a lot with the beehive metaphor, that there's always need for some element of diversity generators within the overall system, that they have to be going off the beaten path in order to open up space for the eventual movement of the whole. When the resource base that's presently being exploited dries up, the diversity generators have already laid out some possible, gossamer still, but pathways towards other ways of being, other ways of doing your thing, right? So I was thinking, sometimes in talks with some students at JFK, we talk about that undecidedness, especially of some of the newer V-memes, right? And that even orange is relatively new enough that it still has some flexibility in how it manifests compared to older forms, especially if you're taking Wilber's basic contention seriously and running with that. So when we have traditional cultures all over the planet, they have the potential to enact a post-traditional mode of being that's technologically informed, that doesn't have to, you could argue, necessarily repeat all the steps and mistakes that the West made in its movement from traditional to industrial. There's the opportunity that an industrial and post-industrial societies could emerge along pathways that are somewhat different from and culturally unique to those regions, from what's been done in the West primarily. It's not inevitable, but because these cultures are all embedded in global systems that all exert their own selection pressures on them, it's really, really hard actually to do a lot of innovation, especially if you don't have adequate buffering around you. And it's easy to be pulled into repeating the same grooves and patterns that have already been laid down.
I think it's ambiguous in this text how much wiggle room Wilber thinks modernity has.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's definitely a utility in seeing the possibility of alternative modernities, because I think if we want to get more clear about developmental stages and make them more useful as a thought tool, we have to disentangle them from the particular histories that led to our particular society, as if we're the product of destiny. Right? There were lots of other modern-like expressions. Right. I always think about Athens. I think about the beginning of the Chinese Empire. I think about, groups of mathematician astronomers in the Mesoamerican kingdoms.
Right.
There were lots of these openings. Now, one of them went forward because it tetrameshed in a different way. It got printing press and lenses for telescopes and microscopes. And then, man, it was off and running. So it's really important to expand ourselves into the pluralistic context of seeing counterfactual alternate histories and understanding that modernity has to be thought differently than just the modernity we inherit.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's all pretty established, but whether it has a lot of chance to change now, I mean, Wilber speaks about it several times in this document, and he mostly says that it's basically fixed, right? Not completely fixed, but strongly fixed compared to pluralism and integrative thinking.
Right.
And I think that's sort of what we're seeing now, which is we have the intuition that because there's progress and because there are this year's new products, right? There's change within the horizon of meaning of modernity. And I think that gives us too strong a sense that modernity itself values change. And it may have been able to do a lot of different modes of itself early on, but there's a collective sense people are confessing to each other fairly regularly now that we feel trapped in the end zone of this system. And all the things that are very promising turn out to replicate the exact same functional system over and over and over again. And where it deviates, it's usually because a progressive or a pre-modern intervention occurred. So the logic of modernity seems pretty locked down at this point, although that's not zero wiggle room, but I feel like Wilber's saying there's not much room to change there.
I look at Japan as an example of going through a kind of modernization that stepped a little bit to the side of exactly what the West has done. They were able to stay true to some of their own sensibilities and ways of doing things that were not totally overtaken by Western models. Though, how successful it all was, I mean, Japan's going through its own crises right now, but when I look at something like Nepal or Ladakh, which now are attempting those moves, even though theoretically on paper it looks like they could do some of their own things, practically what's happening on the ground is the pressures from outside are so intense that it's almost like an inevitable wave pushing them in the same direction of already established forms.
Well, this gets to the heart of conversations I've had with John Bunsell and Forrest Landry and people like that, who one of the things you could say that they're saying is that the international structures generated by modern systems have now reached a level of dominance as the background environment of national economies and national cultures, that the national options are completely constrained at this point, that they can't grapple with that. Something else would have to grapple with that. If they just had freedom to move around on their own, they could try out a number of these different strategies. And there's still some variability, like it does matter who you vote for, but there's a very limited range of flexibility because it's extruded its own shell and is now holding itself much more tightly in place.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So looking at our time and thinking about the rest of the document, what else would you like to look at? You want to look at the post-metaphysics or the...
I think because he sort of names it as a section here, we might want to talk about integral methodological pluralism and also a lot of these considerations he brings in about how the left-hand quadrants and the right-hand quadrants relate. As a former professional academic, and as a guy less likely than myself to have read this half drunk and half dressed, what's your sense of what you sense Wilber's sensing about integral methodological pluralism here? What do you think is the gist of what he's bringing forward on that in this text?
I think he's saying that if we take his model that he's presenting here of the tetra arising of forms along this quasi Whiteheadian line and which I think frees us from certain past metaphysical assumptions and certain more primitive structuralist assumptions. But nevertheless, the way he's framing it as probability spaces, that there's the potential for a new emergent coherence that can be opened up by following all of the multiple lines of inquiry that are available to us and the different kinds of universal enactments that are possible through them. Is the whole autopoetic enactive framing of reality and world spaces allows us to kind of step outside of past inherited metaphysical systems and modernist structuralist systems, and to see, I think, a way towards productive mutual resonance of many forms of inquiry into building a more coherent world picture that actually is necessary in order to meet some of the complexity of the problems that we're facing. And one of the things that, he doesn't say that directly in this document, but for me, one of the things that is really challenging about our time is we're confronting various hyper-object like situations that are problems that are beyond the scale of our ability to address from our usual more grounded and situated approaches. And it's actually computer technology and advanced mathematics and different forms of scientific inquiry and experimentation and innovations in epistemology and all kinds of things that are allowing us to begin to perceive hyperobjects at all, to really intuit their shape and their operation in a way that spans the usual time cones that we operate, in if we're following one or another discipline. And that if we want to have any meaningful grasp on some of the enormous problems that are looming and shaping and constraining us right now, we really need a coordinated marshaling of knowledge approaches in order to, begin to get our heads above water and have some hope of responding to the enormity of what's pressing on us.
The having quadrants or even 8 zones of methodologies, or beyond that, if we wanted to go beyond that, it seems really essential. And I hear him saying that it's essential, and I hear him working very hard to make sure that the levels and the domains of methodology are always deeply entangled in every attempt to solve any problem. Right? I just thought of if you take the methodology in the subjective zone of introspection and phenomenology, that's not the same as saying whatever you experience is real.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because we adjudicate that against the exterior domain and go, well, observers didn't see it in the physics, therefore it wasn't real. It can be inadequate relative to other levels of the prehending of subjective material.
Right.
This is what I think Husserl was trying to do with phenomenology. That's a trans-rational, or at least a rational move. He's saying, look, you're a bad witness of your own subjectivity.
Mm-hmm.
What you think may not be what you think.
Right.
You can gain more levels, new regimes of skill in that regard. So there may be things that are more true subjectively than what you think is subjectively true about your own experience. And that's not in reference to external domains. It's in its own terrain. Each of these terrains is undergoing these prehensions, which occasionally experience these phase-like transitions. And I think that's key to what I would say is the solution, and have said is the solution to the Wilber-Bhaskar problem, or the correlation problem, or where object-oriented ontology comes into this sense that subjective and objective always arise together, right? Because the answer is not based on the fact that the subjective is prehending the objective. That's a misread. Wilber, I think, talks about, the thing in itself is really real as far as he's concerned, and it's presented as being enfolded in the current actual occasion, but that's not putting down its reality in the way people argue when they're trying to thwart correlationism, because he's saying that's happening in these different domains simultaneously. It's not my experience that's prehending the object. And therefore the object's independent dignity is something which always withdraws from or exceeds anything else's experience of it, is not lost, because that's not the process that's being described. The subjective things are prehending the real subjective thing, and objective things are prehending the real objective things. And I don't know if that's just my reading or whether it's really in Wilber, but it seems like that is a solution to that apparent argument, a way of saying that argument doesn't really exist. It's a misreading of what I see in Wilber, right? There isn't a problem of correlationism here, because he's talking about these prehensions in simultaneous different domains. I think I've said this before, the thing that object-oriented ontology is describing in integral theory is the causal state, the indefinite, non-temporal regress of identity of each thing, right? It's not describing the external real things compared to what we internally know about them. It's describing a whole genre of thingness that is inherently withdrawn as an identity. But when we come to this, the traditional notion of facts and interpretations, which Wilber brings up here, which I like because it's one of the many ways he's building on Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche said there are no facts, only interpretations. But he says it a little bit, he's trying to be provocative. He's saying you never find a fact without an interpretation. Mm-hmm. And so Wilber is going to make that a little bit more explicit and sort of hyphenate facts and interpretations. You always only find facts and interpretations because you always only find left-hand and right-hand quadrants. You can't get away from that form of thinking in Wilber. And I think that's one of the real uses of his writing, is to go through a process of understanding where you can't get away from having prehensive levels and multi-domains of epistemology and methodology totally locked together. You can never get them apart.
Yeah, it makes me think of Wilber's 3 principles. And what you're talking about really is the unfoldment aspect of it. Integral methodological pluralism. In one way, there's the non-exclusion, which says that there are these different basic modes of access to reality that align with different fundamental perspectives. Maybe there are others, but that's some basic ones. There are those, and that privileging one over the other has led to distortions, right? So that's the non-exclusion. The enactment, means that what we see is called forth, by a subject with a methodology, right? And the unfoldment is that what you, in taking up a particular perspective, are perceiving is real enough for you for where you are, but you can't assume that that is all that there is to perceive, because it's basically contingent on your own situatedness and your own level of development, your own sophistication in doing the approach, your own interpretive lenses, all of those things. So unfoldment indicates that, I used in an old essay a long time ago talking about the blind men and the elephant, one guy grabbing the ear, one guy grabbing the tail, one guy putting his hand on the side of the elephant. At first, if he put his hand on the side of the elephant, he might say that's a wall. But if he left his hand there long enough and became more adequate to the perception, he would begin to feel how it's rising and falling, begin to feel, subtle organ movements within the system, begin to feel the hair, basically the perception along that trajectory of inquiry would unfold and yield and eventually go through a phase shift where a new perception of what you're beholding emerges along the same path of inquiry. It doesn't, so I think there's that emergence factor, even within a single, approach.
I touched on this earlier. There's a part of this text where he's wants to say there needs to be a single word to describe the evolutionary prehensions in multiple simultaneous or necessarily and ideally interlocking zones. And like I was saying, I'm never going to say tetrahension. I might be willing to say quadratic prehension.
Yeah.
But I don't know if we're 100% sure there's only 4 of these zones.
Right.
Right. So that we're really describing, as a minimum, a developmentally punctuated polyprehension as a basic concept of some kind. And that concept goes along with this new emerging cultural possibility.
I don't know that it would actually also work, because I liked his use of the word comprehension, com with the hyphen and then prehension, because of the prepositional element to that. The com is the with. Basically, it's with prehension, right? It's adjacent prehension, it's mutual prehension, right? The com, as Nancy points out, being is always, the heart of being is the with. That's one element of being is that with. And it's being is always co-being and co-presence. So that could be a minimal thing that you say is, integral methodological pluralism is pointing away towards comprehension in a fuller, more realized understanding of what that means, that prehension with, and that there could be an unbounded, at least there's minimally 4 and probably more types of prehension taking place, that in order to get a good bead on the elephant, you need to be able to hold all of those at once. But the unfoldment principle also points out that even if you're taking account of all of those perspectives, that's not going to be the end of it, because you're still taking account of all those perspectives from a particular vantage point that is not necessarily the terminus of your ability to comprehend things.
A good bead on the elephant.
Is that a little bit too aggressive?
Bruce Alderman, elephant killer.
But they do have an AQAL cross when you
this is getting dark. It's a very interesting text. I guess we're pretty much at the end here. I don't think people can listen to more than 2 hours of this. It's hard a little bit to see why all these different things are in the same excerpt. I'm not sure what a speculative, probability-based, post-metaphysical approach to spirituality necessarily has to do with integral Marxism. I guess if you expand your feeling about what revolutionary integral pluralism means, it does apply to all these topics, but they might have been better appreciated as individual modules or individual texts, so that the person who's really into one of these ideas doesn't get confused and bored by one of the other ones.
Right.
But I certainly found a lot more and differently in it this time than the last time I read through it, partly because I'm different, partly because the culture's different, partly because of our discussions with Ken in person. And maybe you would remind us what the next excerpt is going to be, which hopefully is shorter than this one.
Yeah, I also really appreciated this. I think that's a good point, that it could have been broken up more to be more coherent little elements. But at the same time, they were all supposed to be part of a book, and a massive book, probably an 800-page book that would have contained all of these kind of things, just like Sex, Ecology, Spirituality did. It takes you on a kind of tour de force. So I think maybe this is an arbitrarily chopped up chunk of a tour de force. And I would like to see it ultimately come together someday. Yeah, we're doing Excerpt B. I actually forgot the title of Excerpt B. Maybe I'll look at that while we're talking here. One thing that I really, appreciated that we didn't really cover that much, but we don't have to go into now. I think we are at, enough of a length on this to be digestible. Okay, so yeah, Excerpt B is the many ways that we touch.
That's his deep dive into intersubjectivity, if I remember correctly.
Right. Yeah, I think so. And what you got into, I think, with your talk with Mark and the different layers and forms of intimacy, cosmic intimacy too. So hopefully maybe some of that will come up there. Just looking at his overall presentation of the tetra arising of these different domains of truth and truthfulness and functional fit and meaning, you can really look at those and his discussion of those things and get a good, you could say, anticipatory look at what we're wrestling with now in terms of sense-making crises and meaning crises and the general sense of a legitimation of knowledge. He's really anticipating that back in 2004 and lays out a pretty sophisticated way. I think it doesn't have enough concrete details the way that, Schmachtenberger or Vervaeke and others are getting into in terms of like the nuts and bolts of where the breakdowns are happening. But it does give a very good comprehensive snapshot of, I think, the perfect storm of crises that we're experiencing right now due to these different disjunctions in the overall, AQAL matrix of our cultural whole on at this time.
I think it's really good to link the sense-making problem with the legitimation crisis.
Right.
And Wilber doesn't say authenticity crisis, but he does try to explain how legitimacy and authenticity are a little bit different, where legitimacy is how robustly supported you are at your own level in terms of the functionality of the components and the dimensions that make up any given system. And authenticity is whether a higher or deeper version of that system can be achieved.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about the legitimation crisis. I brought it up a little bit earlier, but one of those big features that's failing in the modern system is that the economic and technological models for modern information distribution through the society are leading modern citizens to be increasingly deranged and uninformed, regardless of their education level.
Right.
So that's a very interesting thing at the horizontal legitimation level. But when we bring in Vervaeke's notions of the meaning crisis, I think in Vervaeke's mind explicitly, there's also an authenticity crisis, which is the wisdom problem. Is there a deeper form of living that's available or not? And is one of the things destabilizing the system its failure to become a higher, deeper version of what it could be and what the people in that system could be?
Right. And Wilber does point to authenticity and the move towards greater authenticity as a way of resolving some of those, issues, but he doesn't go into the depth that, Vervaeke and others are doing. So, but I think it's a good touchstone document for anyone interested in the whole constellation of problems that are being explored right now around sense making and meaning crisis.
It's probably because I was kicked in the head by a mule when I was a kid, but I really enjoyed this.
Well, I don't know if you can see the scar right here, but I took a pretty good head bashing too in my youth. So that's why we're probably good company.
Wasn't an elephant trying to get revenge?
I have been cornered by an elephant against an alley wall. That was pretty scary, but this was a playground thing. So,
well, I look forward to doing the next one, and maybe we'll get some of the details of your playground incident then.
Okay. Great. Well, take care. Talk to you again soon.